Let me focus on emotions for a minute, because that is going to be, as you'll see, an essential part of Sartre's argument. We often say, I couldn't help it, I was just afraid. Or I didn't mean what I said, I was just very angry. Or I'm sorry I was so foolish, I was falling in love. And what's dramatic here is that in each and every case, emotions are being used as excuses. We did something, and now we want to take away our responsibility for doing it, and instead blame it on the emotion. Once again, we have this picture of emotion as something inside us, but at the same time foreign, a kind of intrusion on our rationality, the Freudian it, if you like. But thinking about it, we realize something very different is the case. Take anger. We say, I didn't really mean it, I was just very angry. But the friend whom you insulted knows, and you know yourself, that what you said was not just the product of anger, but it was in fact a very deep, cutting insight that perhaps you had sort of thought of for a very long time but never said before. The fact that you were in truth telling something much closer to the way you really feel than you have in perhaps months or years of casual friendship. Instead of the anger talking and contradicting your own preferences and choices, there's a sense in which the anger itself is a choice. One thinks about how one gets angry, and we talk about this as if it's something that just hits us. And it's true, sometimes the circumstances that make us angry happen very suddenly. But when we get angry, what we do is we make a decision. There might be that first flush as you recognize that you have been gravely offended. But then you have to decide, and often we do this very quickly, what can we do about it? What should we do about it? And you decide at that point whether to forget it or whether to dwell on it, whether to say something back, increasing the odds of increased hostility, or whether to just keep your mouth shut. Let me take the example of love, because perhaps that's the most dramatic. We talk about falling in love. Is there, in fact, such a thing? Well, I believe in love at first sight, and I do believe that you meet people who are just almost chemically dazzling to you. There is a sense in which you meet someone, get very excited, but is that the same thing as falling in love? I think not at all. It's not even infatuation. It's just being excited. Then you have to make a choice. You make a choice, for example, whether or not to continue to look at this person, whether or not to talk to the person. Later on, you have to decide whether or not to date the person, whether or not to marry the person. And in short, when you think about falling in love, it's actually a gradual, or sometimes a rather quick, step-by-step process which involves choices every bit of the way. Put this together, and one comes away with the conclusion that emotions are not simply things that happen to us. They're not excuses, such as the train got derailed, but rather they are choices that we make in a very subtle way, which very strongly influence both the way we see the world and the way we act. And that, of course, is precisely what Sartre is after. This emphasis on choice as opposed to things happening to us extends to other realms as well. For example, consider someone who is shy. Now, the way we generally think about shyness, like most character traits, is it's something like a structure of the personality. And the structure of the personality causes us to behave in certain ways, to perform certain acts. What Sartre suggests is that the causal relationship, if we want to talk about a causal relationship, goes just the other way. That in fact, we are shy because we engage in certain behaviors, because we act in certain ways. This is perhaps most important in the context of the situation he faced in the war, looking at his fellow countrymen and their reactions to the Germans, and also in one of his best plays, a play called No Exit, which I'll talk about in a few lectures. And that's the question about cowardice. Because people are often quite happy to make an excuse for themselves and say, well, I didn't do something, or I won't do something because I'm a coward. And the picture is, here's this structure of one's personality causing us to make certain choices, causing us to perform certain actions. Sartre would say just the opposite. You are a coward because you choose to behave in certain ways. And once again, the whole emphasis gets turned around. Instead of talking about what we are forced to do, or what we have to do, or what we are determined to do, what Sartre puts the emphasis on is the choices that we have within the situation. It's in this sense that we're all responsible, in fact, for the world. When he says we all get the war we deserve, he's referring, of course, not just to that particular circumstance and the different options that one can choose with regard to the war. He's also talking about the consequences of those choices, and he's talking more generally about the kinds of choices we have all the time. Now, a very important point here, which I'll later bury in some fairly heavy Teutonic terminology, but that is, the choices we make are not always self-evident to us. We think of choice very often as something which is essentially deliberate and reflective, as when, for example, you're talking with a friend about which restaurant you'll go to tonight, and you give the different possibilities, and you weigh the options, and you think of the prices, and you talk about it, and you think about it, and the decision in some way emerges from the discussion. But we make other kinds of choices too. In fact, we're making choices all the time, not only in behaviors which Sartre will call unreflective or pre-reflective, behaviors in which we aren't reflecting as such. We just kind of see that something must be done and we choose to do it. But perhaps more importantly, we also behave in those ways when there are all sorts of choices which we never think of. And this is absolutely essential to Sartre's philosophy, as you'll see, because it's an essential part of the political wing of the no excuses issue. Consider, for example, as I say to my classes, the number of things that you could be doing right now instead of being in this class. Some of them, of course, not particularly productive, drinking coffee in the local student cafe, but others. Could you at this point be helping the Red Cross, or serving the homeless downtown, or doing any of a number of other things that you might all think of that would really benefit humanity in a major way? This is not to say you should do it, but it's to say you could be doing it. And according to Sartre, it is also to say you are responsible for not doing it. There's a sense in which what we're doing all the time is making choices to do what we're doing to the exclusion of all sorts of other alternatives which we simply choose not to think about. Now, there's some serious questions that come in here, and Sartre's colleague Maurice Merleau-Ponty raised some of them in his continuing conversations with Sartre, as well as in some of his own books. Is it really fair to people to charge them with responsibility for situations of which they are utterly ignorant? One thinks about the problems that missionaries sometimes face when they are dealing with overseas tribes, people who have never heard of Jesus Christ, and they face the rather awful thesis that despite the fact that these people have never heard of Christ, nevertheless, they are responsible for not taking him in. Well, it's a similar thesis here. What do we say about children who are too young to understand what's going on? What do we say about a peasant in some far-flung country who doesn't have any news, doesn't know how other people live, doesn't know the options that are readily available to us? Well, perhaps we want to modify the thesis in certain ways, but let me simply emphasize what's most important to Sartre. If he's to say we are responsible for the world and the state of the world, then it must be the case that we are not just responsible for those choices which we make deliberately and reflectively, but we're responsible for all sorts of choices that we make, in a sense, out of default or out of neglect, which we don't think about, but which we are capable of thinking about and perhaps should think about. The idea, as always, is no excuses. The fact that you didn't think of it is no excuse. The fact that it is inconvenient or has a great cost is no excuse. As always, what you choose is not just the act, but its consequences. And what you choose, therefore, is the cost. And if you say it's too expensive, it's too inconvenient, it's too difficult, then you're responsible for making that choice too. The idea is you're responsible for yourself and you're responsible for the world. And what I'd like to do in the subsequent lectures is try to make that thesis as plausible as possible.